Along a stretch of Texas highway, a cluster of disappearances and murders have haunted families for decades. Locals called it the Texas Killing Fields, a desolate landscape off I-45 where predators may have hunted and dumped their victims.
Tonight, we look at the pattern, the victims, and the pursuit of answers, plus what's changed recently and what hasn't.
Emergency. No problem. All units
I'm at the corner of Pleasant Hill and John Young Freeway.
1519 East 18.
I'm Jace.
And I'm Charlie.
Our guest today is award-winning true crime author, attorney, and the host of the channel Crime Stands Still, Kerry Droban. Kerry, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Quick content note, this episode discusses homicide and assault. Viewer discretion is advised.
For decades, young women and girls disappeared along the I-45 corridor between Houston and Galveston. Some were found on a 25-acre patch near Calder Road in League City. 4 victims recovered there between 1983 and 1991 are often called the Calder Road Four.
The area offered privacy, concealment, a perfect ingress and egress onto the highway, and conditions for repeat offending.
Let's ground the timeline for the viewers. A wave of cases begins in the early 1970s along the I-45. Then in League City, 4 women are recovered near Calder Road. Heidi Villarreal Fife, 25, remains discovered in 1984. Laura Miller, 16, missing in 1984, remains found in 1986 near where Heidi was found. Jane Doe, which is Audrey Lee Cook, age 30, identified later through forensic works. Her remains were found in 1986. Janet Doe, which is Donna Gonsoulin Prudhomme, age 34, she was identified decades later. Her remains were found in 1991.
And past the 1990s, there are additional abductions and murders associated with the broader I-45 corridor, some now solved and some not. One key name that was tied to multiple late 90s cases has come up, William Lewis Reece, who later confessed and pled guilty in several murders and led investigators to victims' remains. And he received a death sentence in Oklahoma and a few life sentences in Texas.
The Texas Killing Fields is a geographic label that describes a cluster or multiple clusters in a geographic vicinity, which really sort of lends itself to not having a single predator. So different offenders likely occupied that same area or that same terrain and the same opportunities.
Yes, and law enforcement tools have evolved too. So things like DNA, genealogy, and re-examined evidence have driven breakthroughs in recent years, but families still continue to seek answers on many cases.
So now we're going to talk about how the geography might have shaped offender behavior.
And the big question, were there multiple killers? We'll also outline confirmed cases versus those that are still unsolved.
Authorities in Texas have released the names of 2 women whose bodies were found in the so-called Texas Killing Fields. Officials used DNA analysis and genetic genealogy to determine their identities.
So, Kerry, from a criminology perspective, why do highways like I-45 show clusters? Why are places like these so susceptible to crimes of this nature?
Well, first of all, interstates they provide easy access for transients, like it's transient movement, right? I mean, people are just driving by, so they're either crimes of opportunity or they're very strategic because these are in clusters. It provides concealment, provides easy access, There are multiple exits and entry points to get in and out of that interstate. The area itself, this particular area, was very marshy, which provided a lot of concealment and anonymity. I mean, you're not going to have a lot of witnesses along the Interstate 45, especially in the marshlands where, it's a great place to dump bodies, for example. So I think that, and there's also not any sort of technology around there. There's not a lot of cameras or ability to really capture the crime as it's happening. It also allows for, poor lighting. People can access the interstate at night if they need to. But so there's a lot of reasons people would be attracted to an interstate, or particularly this interstate of I-45, because of the marshlands and oil fields that were near Calder Road.
Okay, so let's talk about law enforcement coordination. So, local, county, state, and federal. Where do you think it worked and where did it break down?
So, because it's an interstate, there are multiple jurisdictions that can potentially be involved, and there are multiple coordination gaps as a result. So, there's evidence handling issues. Which jurisdiction is going to claim which body, for starters. Who's going to assign different task forces. There's the chain of custody problem. I mean, interstates can provide a host of problems for law enforcement agencies, which makes them, on the one hand, so appealing for offenders, but so complex and difficult for law enforcement.
Yeah, I can see, especially since it's quite a large area, and not just that, but it's a large stretch of time with a lot of different victims along different areas. And if you wouldn't mind, maybe briefly recapping the four League City victims and what's known about the recovery sites, the cause of death, and identification milestones.
Sure. And just a reminder, you are correct that these murders, the span of time frame was like from the 1970s to the 1990s, which made it even more challenging for law enforcement. But so the first victim was Heidi Villarreal, found in 1984. Then there was Laura Miller, who went missing in 1984, and then she was later found in 1986. Two unidentified women that were later identified as Audrey Cook and Donna Prudhomme. They were identified through forensic efforts like dental records and community tips. And then there was limited biological material. Some of it had been decomposed, some of it had degraded, and it complicated the cause of death for investigators because of that. Some of the evidence suggested that victims were strangled. Some of them had been in the corridor cases, but not all of them, which, of course, made things even more complicated because now you don't have the same modus operandi, the same cause of death in these.
And so, what do those identifications mean for investigative leads?
So whenever you have a Jane or a Janet Doe in this case, when they become Audrey Cook or Donna Prudhomme, then you move from biological evidence to the real world leads. So it's really critical to get an ID because once you have an ID, then investigators can comb through missing person filings. They can go through hospital and ER records. They have their last known contacts. And so this significantly narrows down the window for the suspect activity. So it's really important. The other thing that an identification can give is now it opens this whole social network up. Named victims, they all have families, they have friends, they have coworkers, and partners. So now people can interview people in that network. And they can get, not only people that knew them, but also maybe have suspicious associations. Were there any violent ex-partners, for example? Anybody that's matching these witness reports. The other thing that can lead to, you can kind of see this whole paper trail here. It can lead to subpoenas for phone towers, call records, dates that might possibly have, associated with approximate disappearance dates. Those records can place people at or near the Calder Road or along those transport routes. So it's really important to have a name. The other reason people want to have a name is because if, let's say a victim has been left alone for a while. Now you have more information, so now you can do DNA comparisons with family. You can do genetic genealogy. I mean, sort of the list goes on, but I think what's really important is it allows investigators to see commonalities across victims when you have multiple victims like this, which is how serial patterns are proven or disproven. So, if you have multiple victims, for example, that share a social circle or they were seen with the same person, then that person then becomes a focus. So it is pretty critical.
I completely agree, and I also feel as though having a name to put to a crime helps a lot with the victims' families and a lot of the people who are associated with those victims, being able to identify exactly who did this and how it happened. That brings us to the accusations levied against William Lewis Reece. We're shifting to the 1997 cluster. The victims Laura Smither, 12, Jessica Kane, 17, Kelly Cox, 20, and Tiffany Johnston, 19, who was in Oklahoma. What can you tell us about those?
So Reece becomes a focal point after DNA and statements. He confesses to some of these. But ultimately, I mean, he receives a life sentence in Texas and he's on death row, But the problem is that not all of the cases link him. Reece's confessions or his confessed murders, they span a relatively narrow window. So in particular, the summer of 1997, for example, for the Texas and Oklahoma cases. The Texas killing fields corridor includes disappearances and murders that date back to 1970s. So we have 1970s and 1980s. And so, for example, the 4 victims that were found at the end of Calder Road and the Leak City murders. Because some of the victims predate Reece's release or his active involvement, then it becomes really difficult to link them convincingly to him without additional evidence. So that's one of the problems, right? You have the cases that predate him. The other problem is you have the modus operandi and the victim variation. So Reece targeted young women and girls, and he used isolated sites, and there remains some variation in the victim profiles and the dump sites and the circumstances across the broader corridor. So it becomes really difficult to have a criminal profile that is consistent, that's going to align with one suspect. In the Calder Road victims, for example, they were all adult women, and they were found in the oiled field terrain in the 1980s. Whereas Reece's confessed victims included adolescent girls. So the 12-year-old was Laura Smither. While earlier cases can show features, they don't actually have the signature. So that becomes problematic. Then you have things where, some of the older cases lack strong DNA. There's decomposition, there's environmental exposure, there's time degradation. So in Reece's case, the identification comes after DNA match. So what do you do with those victims where you don't have, DNA? I mean, the recovery's been difficult. Some of the remains, for example, are found in marshlands. He didn't confess to all of them. He didn't account for all of them. And so there are missing pieces there. So I think it's a rush to judgment to say that, you have your suspect in Reece. Mere suspicion or pattern is not sufficient in that one. I guess really problematic thing, which a lot of defense attorneys face, is that Reece's cooperation has been motivated by bargaining, right? He doesn't want the death penalty. He's leading investigators to graves. He's confessed to some of the murders, but he's in exchange for a non-death penalty deal. Given that context, it sort of puts all of his motivation and his confessions into question. So absent corroborating evidence like DNA, then you sort of run the risk of, a false or an inflated confession. And so it leaves some of the victims that are in this kill web that are unaccounted for. So that's sort of the danger of landing on one victim, on one suspect.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what I was going to ask, which I think you may have just answered here is, what would be your key takeaway for our viewers on this? And it sounds like there could be multiple individuals utilizing this area. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's more accurate to say that it involved multiple offenders, because anytime you have a
Mm-hmm.
corridor, multiple people, I mean, suspects could be These could be crimes of opportunity. The Calder Four, for example, suggest that this was somebody who was familiar with the area because of the decades time span. Now you've got people that, may have been incarcerated at the time the victims were murdered. So you've got really all things pointing to multiple offenders and multiple dump sites, multiple modus operandi, multiple signatures. So I think the idea that this was one perpetrator is really far-fetched.
I completely agree. The fact that there have been, if I recall, around over 30 victims in the last few decades in this same area. And if you wouldn't mind to briefly touching on those other names that are often discussed by media and family, names of suspects and other offenders that might have utilized this area, and maybe clarify what's established versus what's alleged.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are at least two that have been sort of they come up pretty often, especially in related to the I-45 killers. One is Kevin Edison Smith. He was convicted in 2012 of the 1996 murder of a 13-year-old, Crystal Jean Baker. Her body is discovered under an interstate bridge in Chambers County, Texas. And she's identified through DNA evidence that's obtained after, an unrelated drug arrest. The DNA connected him to this one victim. But again, you have the problem that she's not the right victim profile, right? She's 13 years old. We have the Calder victims who are all adults. So we have this variation again of victim profile and dump sites. Crystal is found under an interstate bridge, which is more suggestive of a crime of opportunity than a crime, a suspect who's out there hunting his victims, who's familiar with the area, who, specifically wants to dump them for reasons of concealment, anonymity, no witnesses, etc. So it really doesn't match that, but his name has been bandied about a lot with relation to this case. So he was sentenced to life in prison. The other person is Clyde Hedrick, and he was convicted in 2014 for the 1984 manslaughter of Ellen Ray Simpson Beeson. Now, her decomposed remains were found in a wooded area in Galveston County. Again, the MO, the location, the way the body is found, all of that is not consistent with one perpetrator, because that's really the only one that he's been related to. And when he initially confessed to it, he claimed that she drowned accidentally, but then later he admitted to her death. So it's murky, and it's not the same particular killing field. It's now in a wooded area. He's not a good suspect to pin all of these murders on.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Kerry. And after this video, we will start our structured Q&A, where we're going to ask you some questions that our viewers most want to know and understand.
In the 80s, League City was a small Galveston County town that enjoyed its distance from the big city. That small town bubble was pierced when bodies started showing up in an abandoned oil field off Calder Road. What impact did that have on the town?
It had quite a bit. I mean, it was just a huge shock to the city that, was just a small town. Lions Club Village Fair every year was the biggest thing that was going on.
So I do think that the most pressing question is one that we've already sort of answered, whether there are multiple killers or just one. I personally feel as though it has to be multiple killers involved in all of these, the victims that we have discussed. But do you also believe, what the strongest evidence is either way? And also, do you believe that there might have been multiple serial killers who utilized this area?
I do think it's multiple killers. And I think the possibility of having a serial killer or even multiple serial killers is also viable because you have a decades-long spread of murders, right, from 1970s to 1990s. And some of the murders are committed while known suspects are incarcerated or they're in another city or they're dead, so you don't have the same person doing the same thing. So you want to look, anytime you have a pattern like this, you want to look at time gaps and variations in that pattern, variations in victim profile, for example, or lifestyles. I mean, you have everything from a preteen, 12-year-old in Laura Smither, to adults who were murdered on Calder Road. You have their lifestyles. I mean, some were runaways, others were students, some were workers. And so you have these differences in victimology are really important because they really telegraph who their killer might be. And the way that they were killed is also very telling. I mean, they're different. If you have a serial killer, you're going to have the same MO largely, unless it evolves somewhat, but really you're going to have the same MO. So in this case, I mean, many of the victims were strangled, some were shot, some were dumped fully clothed, others were partially naked. Then you have those that we only have skeletal remains, or some that are decomposed, so we don't know how they were disposed of. So, and then you have multiple dump sites as well. So if you're going to have a serial killer or one predator, they're really going to probably gravitate back to the same dump site. Why? Because they already have had, success at that dump site. They haven't been found out. There aren't witnesses. So there's no reason for them to deviate. So the fact that there are multiple dump sites is pretty telling. And then there are dump sites that are far enough apart to suggest that, maybe the killer drove there. So maybe there were multiple vehicles involved. And if you have multiple vehicles, then you have multiple predators, right? So then you have who maybe had knowledge of the ingress and egress of this interstate, which would suggest familiarity with the area, like the Calder Road, for example, the oil fields and the marshlands. Maybe the killer knew that if he dumped a body there, they would, sink into the marsh and it would be concealment for him. Others seemed opportunistic, like they didn't really pay attention to the area that way. For example, the killers dumped his body off of a highway bridge, or a wooded lot. So that suggests that this was maybe crimes of opportunity because they weren't as familiar with the area. The other thing that is really sort of telling about this whole corridor is if it was a single predator or if some of the murders were clustered. I keep coming back to the Calder Road murders because, if they're clustered like that, that would be indicative of perhaps a suspect who is not only familiar with the area, but maybe lives near the area, like maybe works in the vicinity and uses that interstate section, to come and do that. So these are not necessarily crimes of opportunity, but they're familiarity with the area. So that's, some key points. And then there's the fact that you have at least 2 to 3 suspect or killers who have been convicted of separate killings, right? And they all point to multiple predators because they've been matched through DNA. So, why weren't they matched to all of them? Already you have 3 different killers, right? So that just bodes well for them having multiple predators in this scenario.
So you had mentioned in that Calder Road area, you said, marshlands and oil fields. Are there specific features about that or other features of that specific area that would make it a favored site for an offender to repeatedly use over and over again?
Yeah, I think so. Apart from the fact that perhaps the killer was, familiar with the area and lived nearby or worked nearby, there are other reasons why that particular section would have been attractive to a killer. It was very secluded, so there's low visibility. There was limited public access. There are natural barriers for concealment, right? So you have ditches, small trees, there's uneven ground, it's marshland. There's multiple points of access, ingress and egress off of the interstate. You have this idea that maybe it was comfortable, it was a comfort zone for the killer because, he hadn't been caught before. He had been disposing bodies and no one seemed to notice. You have environmental factors too, right? Which if you dump a body, whether it's clothed or not clothed, and you dump a body in a marshland, right, with like mushy soil, it's going to slow decomposition. It might encourage scavenger activity. There's vegetative cover. So there's any number of things, but I think mostly it's a site that is tested. So this offender, at least we know of 4 bodies that are likely related because we have the same, MO, the same victimology, and we have the same area. So I think that because that site has been, quote, tested, that offender would be more likely to return to that same site.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And what breakthroughs came from the DNA found in genetic genealogy? And more importantly to me, what are the limitations of that sort of evidence?
So I think the breakthrough was DNA extraction. I mean, you have, with advances in DNA, they were able to extract from a skeletal remain or decomposed remains, which allowed laboratories to then build genetic profiles. So now you've got the Jane and Janet Does who, once upon a time did not have an identity, now have an identity. And of course, that leads to much more results-oriented investigation. So, genetic genealogy databases can allow investigators to match DNA to distant relatives, for example, maybe construct a family tree, narrow down possible identities. The result, of course, was Audrey Cook and Donna Prudhomme, who were identified. And this provided the investigators with a name and, a social history and these networks. And so it allowed identifications and DNA allows investigators to reopen older case files to then sort of go back and correlate timelines or detect potential links between victims. For example, I mean, they asked the question, did these victims know each other? Did they work together? So it can allow you to confirm or exclude potential suspects. The challenge, of course, comes from older remains, right? Where you have DNA that might be too degraded to generate a usable profile. And so, that's a problem. And then the other issue, of course, is the environmental exposure. The longer a body, for example, lies out in the sun or, in soil that is marshy, you're going to have that soil chemistry can destroy biological material. You also have insects. I mean, not to get really graphic here, but there's a lot of ways that a body can degrade or decompose to the point where DNA is going to be unhelpful. But the one thing that really sort of became sort of a breakthrough in this particular cluster was dental records. So they were able to identify at least one of the victims through dental records. And so that became a huge breakthrough. So I think there are mostly pros with DNA, but obviously there were some cons because of the age of the bodies and the environmental exposure.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you think investigators reconcile media labels like I-45 killer with the case-by-case evidence?
I think media labels they can be helpful, but they can also be really hurtful because anytime you're going to label something, you're opening it up for sort of, well, it's actually the opposite. You're not opening it up. You're actually closing the investigation because you're labeling it as I-45. So what if there are other areas or other clusters, that have yet to be investigated? And so you're sort of encapsulating, you're going off of what the media has, and the media oftentimes doesn't have enough information or all of the information, and they're tending to sensationalize, the case that is very unhelpful in a lot of respects to investigators. So I think that can be detrimental.
So if you could go and re-examine one early case with today's tools, which would it be and why?
I think that I would choose the Atlanta child murders from this same period of time, ironically, from 1979 to 1981. That was a case where you had 29 African-American children and young adults who were killed over 2 years. And it created one of the most infamous unsolved murder sprees in U.S. history, I think. And there was one person who was convicted, Wayne Williams, who was convicted for 2 of the adult murders, but he was never definitively linked to any of the child victims. I think if you were to take the forensic technology, right, then and now, that forensic technology and the biological evidence of the hairs and the fibers and the touch evidence that was retained from the crime scenes, I think you would be able to maybe revisit that, right? Extract DNA from tiny skin cells, for example, or maybe that could link them to other objects like clothing or windows or furniture, that might link them to potential perpetrators even decades later. And then you have something called MVAC collection, which is a vacuum-based method that they use to recover microscopic biological material from surfaces. So this would be really useful, for example, on textured or porous surfaces, where maybe you couldn't take a traditional swab. So the technology or the advancement of MVAC collection could really help. It could help recover, cells from fabrics or carpet fibers, for example, in the Atlanta cases. And then you have something called proteomics, I can't even say the name, which is basically you're studying a complete set of proteins in one sample. I mean, not to get too technical, but you can basically identify body fluids and tissue types based on protein markers. And so it's useful, right? If DNA is too degraded, for example, you can analyze that. It's too degraded to analyze, the proteins are still intact. So you can use that new technology to analyze that. I think it would be really useful to use the modern tools to go back in time and revisit some of those older cases and maybe get perpetrators. I mean, so I think the potential impact, right, is that you could confirm or refute, for example, in the Atlanta cases, whether or not Wayne Williams was involved in any specific child murders. And then you might uncover evidence that was pointing to additional perpetrators, for example. But you could definitely redefine the investigative narrative, right, that was shaped by that. So you have all the circumstantial evidence and you have the media pressure. But if you had those specific technologies, you could go back and really revisit that.
Technology has come such a long way. I didn't even know the things that you just spoke of existed. That's phenomenal. What do you think that families have taught investigators or family taught investigators that the files could not?
Well, I think families, once you can identify a suspect or identify a victim, the families are the most persistent, right? They keep the case alive. And so I think that they may reveal patterns that a lot of investigators have overlooked, for example, last seen locations, maybe relationships that the investigators never knew were relationships, common routes, maybe vehicles that victims used, very specific details that investigators might not otherwise uncover, but for the family. I mean, the family, for example, could let them know, my loved one took a specific route to work every day, and on this particular day happened to, go down I-45, So, I mean, there's any number of details or clues that could really steer an investigation because the families are the most vigilant in trying to solve these cases because they live with this every day of their lives.
And that is why I really appreciate a lot of documentaries that involve the families of the victims and that interview them specifically. How do you feel public pressure and these sorts of documentaries impact cold cases and their momentum?
I personally love documentaries that are done on these cases because I think it's really important to keep revisiting these old cases because without that pressure, without the families being able to speak out and being able to talk to such a wide audience through the media, these cases would just disappear and these victims would remain nameless. And so I think it's hugely important. And I think documentaries particularly are hugely important because, not only keeping the victims top of mind, but also in many cases recreating or reenacting the crimes so that, if the family's being interviewed, they can at least be able to provide, details or insights into what they may know about the crime as it's being reenacted. So I think they're hugely helpful for the most part.
So, what would you say are like some safety lessons without victim blaming? If you were to be able to tell the viewers living in or along these high transit corridor areas, like what are some things you should know?
Well, I think particularly now with all of the increased technology and the the apps that are available now, I think it's really important for people to remain vigilant and have situational awareness. I know many of us may drive the same route to work every day, and so we kind of zone out as we're driving. But I think it's really important to pay attention to what's going on around us. Verified ride shares, for example. I mean, any of us that use Lyft or Uber can share the route, with a family member or somebody else, just to make sure that they arrive at the place that they're supposed to arrive to on time. They can create buddy systems, particularly women that want to go out, to a bar or to another scene. Have a buddy that is going to, not just as your designated driver, but somebody who's going to keep a watch on you while you're in that location. So I think that's really important. Here's an easy one: license plate capture, right? I mean, how many times you're driving down the freeway, it's so easy to pay attention to the license plates in front of you. Community reporting. Don't be afraid to, if you see something, say something. I think there are many of us that are afraid sometimes to get involved, to afraid that we're going to report the wrong thing or cause undue alarm, So I think it's really important to report it, let somebody else determine whether or not it's going to be valuable information or not. And emphasize, offender accountability. I think there are many scenarios or situations, again, that sort of correspond to being afraid of reporting something, afraid of holding somebody accountable. If you see something, say something. If you see something that seems not entirely, your gut is telling you something is wrong, hold that person to account. And I think once you get in the habit of doing that, or once we really pay attention to where we are and use the apps that are provided to us, use the technology in hand, I think we can really make huge advances in some of these maybe crimes of opportunity, for example. Maybe they don't become so easy anymore because now you've got eyes on the potential victims. So I think that's really important to hold that awareness.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that a little bit, I mean, especially on highways like the ones that we're discussing today, the bystander effect has so much presence just because everybody has somewhere to go. Everybody is in a bit of a hurry. And like you said, nobody wants to be the one to get something wrong. But I think that also feeds into how people talk about the case. What do you feel are the biggest myths and what do you think is some misinformation that has been spread about the Texas killing fields?
Well, I think it's easy, I guess, to sensationalize a case. So if you're not directly involved in the case, you're not a family member of the victim, you're not one of the investigators, I think it's easy to get caught up in this sort of hysteria or sensationalism or frenzy, that sort of lends this quality of one killer did it all, or the area is cursed, or it's not only a funnel for misinformation and misdirection, but it also can have a chilling effect or a paralyzing effect on anybody that wants to come forward to help with information. So I think it can be really detrimental to a case to have, myths arise out of it. I mean, the Texas killing fields. Well, I mean, first of all, a lot of people may not know what that is. They may not understand that it's a corridor that has, multiple ingress and egress. I mean, they may not know what the area entails, and why it's been so complicated and challenging for investigators to find the perpetrators of these crimes. So I think it's really important to just deal in facts and not sensationalize a case and not stir up hysteria or panic about a case. Or an area, because I think it can really deter a lot of the investigation.
And what do you think meaningful accountability would look like for the still unsolved cases?
I think first and foremost, transparency. I think it's really critical to share information, to not be withholding information, because you just don't know where that particular nugget is going to go. You don't know who's got a detail or information about a case that could really send it in a whole new direction. So I think you have to get transparent updates. I think it's important to continue to fund cold case units. I think that oftentimes they are the last units to be given any attention to. Investigators that are assigned to the cold case files, don't have any sense of urgency behind it. And I think if they're adequately funded, if the cases are kept top of mind, if there's a way or a mechanism, we have a whole army of internet sleuths out there. If there's a way for them to be updating and providing information, I think that should be made available to them. I think that there has to be legislation for retention and testing of sex kits. There has to be public DNA databases so that when we get hits, they don't go through this complicated scenario where oftentimes they miss it. I mean, the DNA databases should and can have safeguards to them so that if the public is worried, their information is going to be shared. So I think there has to be some public assurance. There has to be transparency. There has to be funding, adequate resources applied to cold case units. I mean, all of that, I think, would make this meaningful and hold people to account.
Going back to the 1997 cases that were tied to William Reece, maybe walk us through what do you feel convinced investigators?
I think that, William Reece is a little bit complicated, for one, because I do think that he was motivated by bargaining, right? He didn't want the death penalty. But I think that what convinced them was obviously he was matched by DNA to at least one of the murders. He confessed. He was willing to show them multiple sites, of bodies. So I think that they definitely, he was in their sights, and he seemed to be a credible suspect for at least some of the cases. And so I think that's what really nailed it. I mean, the DNA and that, but I mean, I think you also have to look at the fact that he wasn't linked to a majority of the cases, and the victim profile differed across, victims. And so I think there were definitely problems with Reece's confession and conviction, but it did lead to one of the murders. So I think it gave them a starting point.
And for the Calder Road 4, what are realistic next steps?
Well, I think it's important to retest the retained items in that case, because, with the new technology and advances in forensics, I think it's really important to be able to see what new information will come to light. I think it's important to go back and canvass aging witnesses, people that still may have information about something on that related to that case. I mean, they may be years older now, but people do remember startling events, or they remember, maybe they can offer help or tidbits on the timeline to narrow that down. Leverage travel and commerce records, because now we have a lot of that. Let's see who was, how highly trafficked that area was. Maybe do a remapping of the offender areas. I mean, it's such a wide corridor, but the Calder Road 4 really gives us a window into a narrow timeline. And I think that pattern and those timelines are really critical to perhaps solving some of the other murders. But I think, to start there, because at least we have the same victimology, we have, the same dumping ground, we have potentially the same timeline. I think for law enforcement purposes, you want to start with consistency. Like, what do you know? What do you know, and what can you improve on from that? That's where I would start if I was a law enforcement investigator.
Honestly, me too. And we do know that because of the number of victims and the timelines all sort of converging together, we do know that the FBI does eventually get involved. What do you feel the role of the FBI's Highway Serial Killings Initiative is in cases like these?
I think in a lot of instances, it's sort of similar, because whenever you have a corridor, and you have multiple victims, dumped along the corridor, maybe not in exactly the same site, I think it lends itself to patterns, right? Patterns, timelines, and I think that's and in multiple jurisdictions, right? Because that's obviously you're crossing jurisdictions, which is why the FBI gets involved, right? So I think it's really important to do like offender mapping, case linkage. Is there any way that the Calder Road Four, for example, could be linked to later victims, right? And what is that link? And so I think it's really important to do that, and not to fight or disagree with or dismiss any of the local theories, right? Which I think happens quite frequently, because when one jurisdiction takes over, they sort of, headbutt. And I think it's really important for them to be able to take the information that they already have, expand upon it, offer new theories and suggestions, and maybe do that offender mapping. Like maybe, it is a serial killer that's spanned 2 decades, that changed for whatever reason the part of the corridor, changed the victimology. I mean, it's unlikely, I think, in my opinion, but I think at least it's a starting place for the FBI to contribute to what has already been done in these cases.
If a viewer knows something today, even small, what's the minimum detail that could still help after decades?
I think it's always helpful, like dates, license plates, family connections that maybe investigators didn't know about before. Are there vehicle descriptions that maybe were unknown prior? Maybe there are photographs that some of the family members have that offer clues to that, either the victimology. I mean, when you don't know who your suspect is, you turn to your victim, right? And you find out, okay, what would have been attractive to the suspect? What are the commonalities here? Was it a common hangout, for example? Was there a reason that these particular victims were chosen or taken? I mean, were they easy marks? So all of those things are still really viable and important for families to know and to be able to assist.
When talking about these sort of cases, we try to be as respectful and careful as possible. What ethical guardrails should creators follow when covering cold cases such as these?
I think it's really important, and I think you touched on this earlier, is not to blame the victim, right? Not to defame in any way what they might or might not have done, right? I mean, they're a victim. They didn't ask for it. They didn't deserve this, and it's important to solve this. And so, I think whenever you resort to defamation or victim blaming, then you're really missing the mark. You're not solution oriented. And so, I think it's really important. And just stepping back just a second to when documentaries happen. I do support documentaries profiling these cases again, but I also think it's really important to be mindful that, a lot of these families have endured a lot of trauma. And so revisiting these cases and reopening old wounds can be very significant as well. So I think there has to be a level of compassion and understanding when dealing with these kinds of cases and these family members, because even though these happened decades ago, the trauma is still very present. So that's just one thing. So I would encourage, though, families or the ethical guardrails. I mean, the question that you asked was to coordinate with law enforcement, share tip lines, share information, be transparent, disclose what you know. This is not a time for concealment. I mean, there are multi-jurisdictions involved here, and multi-agencies. And so each agency is going to do their own data collection and their own assessment of suspects. And I think it's important to share, but to always keep tip lines open, make them anonymous so nobody feels compelled to come forward if they don't want to, but to always be very victim and family centered, because they, in the end, are the ones who have suffered the loss. We're doing it from a very sort of cold, clinical, intellectual, viewpoint to solve a case. But these were real people, real victims, real families, and they're still suffering and still hurting. And so I think that's really important to keep top of mind.
A stretch of land off of I-45 is connected to a dark and sinister past. The bodies of 4 women have been found in the area throughout the 80s and 90s, now deemed as the Texas killing fields. Years later, there are lingering questions about the murders.
Next, we're going to walk through the major theories that people raise about the I-45 corridor and the Texas killing fields. And we're going to stress where evidence supports or undercuts them.
Yes, these are frameworks. They are not conclusions. We will be explicit about what's confirmed, what's likely, and what's speculative.
So, Kerry, what would we expect to see if it were a single offender responsible for most of these cases?
First and foremost, I think the time span would have to coincide with an individual who either lived in the area, worked in the area, had access to this particular corridor, right, for that length of time. Because he would have to have a reason to want to come back to a similar dump site. And that reason would be usually easy proximity. You know, he doesn't want to get caught. He wants to be able to take his victims, do whatever he's doing to them, dump them, and get away with it. So if it's a single predator, you want stable victimology, same MO. You know, does he strangle all of them? Does he shoot all of them? I mean, it would be one single way of doing it. If he's strangling them, does he carry a rope with him in his car? And is it the same vehicle? Is it the same time of day that he does this? You know, does he do it after work? Does he do it when it's dark, when the likelihood of anybody seeing or noticing is reduced even more? Does he do it at a certain time of year? I mean, that's something that, you know, an investigator would look at the time span and say, is this happening during a particular season? Does it correspond to any particular event that's going on, you know, in the proximity of these cities, right? Which would bring the suspect or the victims to the attention of the suspect. So all of those things would be really important if this were one predator. So you're looking at geography, proximity, dump sites, victimology. It would probably, in my opinion, not be crimes of opportunity. I think that it would be much more calculated and methodical. That's what I would look for.
And so then that would lead us to another theory or next theory, which would be the opportunity structure. So many offenders, same geography. Why is this theory so compelling?
I think for some of the same reasons that it might be a single predator is, you know, if it's a crime of opportunity. So an interstate offers that anonymity, that ability to pick up a hitchhiker, for example, or pick up somebody randomly who's in your car, you know, for whatever scenario the suspect has created, and then just do whatever they're going to do and then dump them over the side of the road. You know, that would be somebody who it's probably a one-time thing. They're just, you know, I don't know, spree killers, whatever you want to call it, where they're looking for the opportunity to, you know, feed their fantasy, their habit, whatever it is, and then dispose of the body. So they're not very careful with how they're disposing the body, which would explain why some of them were either partially clothed, fully clothed. I mean, it runs the gamut because we don't know what state they were in. We don't know whether, you know, the perpetrator had to shoot them quickly. That would, to me, would bode more toward a crime of opportunity if somebody shoots them and then dumps them over the side. The fact that there were locations like under the bridge or in a wooded area suggests, again, crimes of opportunity because they're not thought out. Yeah, so I think it would emphasize this stretch of road, which again is like a cluster, right? So they're not all in one particular area. So I think the fact that it stretches over a significant, you know, roadway is also indicative of an opportunist.
Just how much of the late 90s cluster can be explained by William Reece, and what can't? Because we know that a few of the victims don't fit the same profile.
Well, I think what's important with Reece is, you know, the idea of trying to figuring out, like, distinguishing between corroboration, like what corroborating evidence would corroborate his confession versus what would distinguish it, right? What would link other cases perhaps to Reece that, could you eliminate or, completely say, well, these can't be Reece because he wasn't in that area during the 70s, or during the 80s, So I think that, the one case that he confessed to in 1997, I think you would have to ask, well, what was it that brought him to that location in 1997? Was it, and why in the summertime? Was he passing through? Was it an event? Was it seasonal? So all of that would sort of fit into, whether or not, whether it can be explained by Reece being the only killer. And then you want to take these maybe unverified claims and see if you can verify them, because he had motivation to lie. He had motivation to confess, And so I think all of that sort of, in my opinion, like really points away from Reece being the murderer of all these victims. But I think if you're trying to connect him to multiple victims, those would be the areas that you'd want to focus on. Like who can corroborate his claims? If you take away the idea that he's going to not get the death penalty, is he still going to come forward? He doesn't have any incentive at that point, So I think it's all of those factors are going to contribute.
How plausible do you think it is for the theory of transient trucker, long haul truck driver for these cases or some of these cases?
It's certainly plausible for the kinds of proximity. If you were able to map out the dump sites, the locations where a lot of the bodies were found, and they corresponded to local trucker hubs, or like places where a trucker would likely pull in for the night or, to gas up, like a Love's station or something. I think then you could maybe say, all right, it's possible. They have a very transient lifestyle. It'd be very easy for them to commit a murder, dispose of the body, and move on, and nobody would ever know, right? They don't have any ties to the place. But I think it's less likely from the victim's perspective, because the victims would have had some kind of reason to be local. There's, a short disappearance window of, so I think a lot of it depends on how you would map that geography and the span and whether there are trucker hubs near it. But it's certainly a plausible theory. They certainly could do it, but I think it's probably unlikely just given the victim profile again.
Some do theorize that a number of the later killings are a result of media contagion. Do you feel publicity about the killing fields have inspired copycat behavior?
Certainly media can inflame copycat behavior in a lot of cases. It's more so now than probably at that time, because you're talking 70s, 80s, 90s, right? So I think it would be probably unlikely that it would have spurred a copycat, but certainly it's possible. The only other reason I think that it's more unlikely is you have, again, this very long span of time. Decades, right, where these are happening. And so I think the likelihood of having these victims sort of in the news, in the media for that period of time to be able to spurn that would be really difficult. Usually copycat killers are pretty instantaneous. They come out and they're because they literally want to be aligned or associated with the perpetrator that's doing them. So I don't think that it's that likely, but definitely media labeling can lend itself to that, can lend itself to mimicry, people wanting to jump on that bandwagon and get credit for these horrific things. But I think in some of those scenarios, it's much more likely to have copycats when you have sensational crimes that are, exploding all over the media. In this case, you have the very fact that they're being dumped off of the interstate in very concealing, secluded areas is sort of the opposite of what you would find in a copycat killing.
So another theory is that forensic genealogy will relink cases. So can new DNA or forensic methods meaningfully connect or separate corridor cases now?
I think a lot would depend on chain of custody. It would depend on how that DNA was preserved and the time frame. I mean, maybe probably in the newer cases, but we're talking like 70s, 80s. I think it would be very difficult. A lot of that DNA might be degraded to the point where it's not usable anymore. But maybe more beneficial than that, more than linking cases, it might be able to differentiate cases if you're able to do that. So it's tricky with cases this old, but certainly there are, with the advances in technology, it's definitely possible. And then, some of the victims were sexually assaulted. So I think that would be helpful, to be able to differentiate them.
These are all interesting talking points. Do any of these theories resonate with you? Let us know in the comments, or let us know if you have a theory of your own that we didn't discuss.
And if you have any information about the Calder Road victims or related I-45 cases, contact local authorities. Time shrinks memories, so you need to act now.
And for League City cases, you can reach the Cold Case Unit by phone or email. You can also submit tips to appropriate county sheriffs or the Texas Rangers.
Even partial details, old photographs, a remembered vehicle, a workplace rumor, anything like that can matter. I mean, don't second guess yourself and think it's not going to be important, because it just might be the linchpin to the case.
And to further support investigative coverage, share this episode and send credible tips to Crime Solvers Central. We'll pass along relevant info to law enforcement when requested. Links and numbers are in the description.
Kerry, thank you so much for lending your expertise. And to all of the families, we see you.
And thank you all for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and stay loud.